So here we are at Sewing and Slippers with Sue. I'm Sue Pellant, and I love to share with you my love of quilting. The first thing that I specialize in is applique quilts. So if you are looking forward to learning how to applique, I have some wonderful information for you. But today we're going to take a step back and we're going to go even further back in my history. We're going to talk about making quality quilts, and one of the steps in making a quality quilt is cutting and adding your borders. So we're going to talk all about borders today, and we're not really going to talk about applique. Well, let me tell you where I'm coming from. I'm going to be making this quilt with a group of students starting this evening. Our kickoff for CAFE clamshells is today. And in order to get ready for that kickoff, I need to get my borders ready. And some of my students said I'm having trouble cutting those long borders. So I wanted to do a tutorial on cutting long borders for any quilt. But today I'm going to get my borders ready for this quilt. Now in the CAFE Clamshells course, you're going to have the opportunity to choose between 3 sizes of that quilt. And if you're not taking the course, you can grab the instructions for making that quilt in my second book. That book is Hearts and More, Rotary Cut Applique. I'm just going to type that into the comments, so if you're watching this on YouTube later, you will be able to find that pattern. Hearts and More, Rotary Cut Applique. That's the name of the book that I'm referring to when I'm talking about the cover quilt, which is the CAFE clamshell quilt. Well, I love to teach all kinds of quality techniques, and one of those is fusible applique. But today we're not going to be doing any applique. We're simply getting ready for that course. And every quilter can use this tutorial on cutting your borders. Now, cutting borders can be tricky because when you're cutting a long piece of fabric, how do you get that fabric perfectly straight? And if you've ever had the experience of hanging a quilt in a quilt show and your borders were rippling, we're going to talk about getting borders that lay flat and straight so that you can win competitions, so that your borders are going to be expertly added, so they're going to fit perfectly, and you're going to get nice flat quilts. Now, not only is that important on a hanging quilt, hanging in a show, or a wall quilt that's hanging on the wall, it's also important on your bed quilts because you want the sides of your quilt and the bottom of that quilt to lay nice and flat when it's on your bed. So let's talk about all of the steps involved in putting on good quality borders onto your quilt. Okay. I don't think that we're fuzzy. I think we're good. I see somebody says that the picture is fuzzy. Anybody else, let me know if your picture is fuzzy. All right, well, I have printed out the layout instructions for my quilt in 3 different sizes. And today I'm going to be working with the smaller size, but the techniques that I'm going to go over with you are for any size border. Let's see, our actual size of our king size borders is 107 inches. Well, I'm going to work a little bit smaller than that today, but all of the same principles apply. My longest border for my lap size quilt that I'm going to be making are 72 inches. So we're going to start there, making our 72-inch borders. Okay, we look good. That's awesome. So on the layout, what I have here is how you're going to cut your borders. Now let's talk a little bit about planning your fabric for the borders. A lot of quilters these days, and a lot of online quilters that you may be familiar with, are cutting your borders across the width of fabric and then sewing those together to make the borders long enough for your quilt. That's not a method that I am a fan of. And yeah, it's a little controversial because in order to cut your borders lengthwise, the whole length of your quilt, you may need a little bit more fabric. So we're going to talk about getting your fabric ready for those borders and how to cut those borders. And we're also going to start with how to plan how much fabric you need. So when I planned out the design for my quilt, and I did this in EQ, I like to use Electric Quilt to plan out my my layout so that the diagram that comes out of EQ has all the measurements for the borders. It doesn't show up that way, but there's a way to get those measurements from Electric Quilt. Of course, you can use the old graph paper method as well, and you can figure out your center size. Your center size if you're doing a long horizontal border. So your borders top and bottom are the long ones. That saves you fabric. You can measure the length of your center of your quilt, and this border right here will be the same length as the center of your quilt. But you'll notice my measurements, this one says it's 42 inches for the actual size of that border. My instructions over here say to cut 43 inches. I always oversize my borders a little bit. I'm still going to measure exactly 42 inches when I put that border on the quilt, but I oversize it when I cut it just to be absolutely sure I've got a border that's long enough. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So the sizes of the borders that I need an inside border, that's the applique border on the quilt. And I need an outside border. That's also an applique border, but it looks like it's done with curved piecing. That's the clamshell border. Now on this quilt, we're going to have the opportunity to do long horizontal borders. That's a typical way to put borders on a quilt. We're also going to have the chance to do mitered borders. So if mitered borders scare you, they won't after you take this course, because we're going to go through the instructions for mitering your borders inside this course. But today we're going to tackle the long horizontal borders because that's the way most people put borders on their quilt. It's a little simpler way. So in order to cut your long horizontal borders, we're going to measure the inside of our quilt the long way, the length of that inside of the quilt, and in this case it's 42 inches. So I need to cut my border 43 inches. My borders for this quilt, the 43-inch border is 7.5 inches wide. Now there's something funny about this quilt. The borders are different sizes, top and bottom and side to side. So I want you to pay attention to that if you're taking the clamshell course or if you're reading the instructions in my book. Why are the borders different sizes? Because we need a specific size on our outer border that has to be a multiple of 5 in order to lay out our 5-inch clamshells evenly on that border. So I've adjusted the sizes of the applique border so it makes both outside borders a multiple of 5. So if you're not making this quilt and you just want to know how to cut those nice straight borders, we're going to move on to that now. Just realize that I'm cutting 2 different size borders. One is 7.5 inches and one is 6.5 inches. Oh, I just noticed a little error on this and I'll make that change on the final pattern. These are finished sizes and my cut sizes have to be a little bit bigger. Okay. So we're going to cut the border that's going to finish at 7.5 by 42. We're going to cut that 8 inches wide, and it's awfully nice because 8 inches wide, you can fit 4 of those across your 40-inch width of fabric. So if your borders are less than 10 inches wide, you're going to be able to get 4 of those across the length of fabric, and that's going to use your fabric so efficiently when you're cutting borders for your quilt. Now, what happens if your borders are wider than 10 inches? Say I have a 12-inch border. If I need to cut 4 borders 12 inches wide, that's wider than 40 inches, isn't it? It's 48 inches. So I'm going to need to buy 2 lengths of fabric for those borders. Now, when I calculate my measurements for my quilts, I always figure out long borders with no seams in the borders. Now, some people think that that's a waste of fabric. The way that I plan my quilts, I use the extra fabric. Or oftentimes, I'm going to put it back in my stash and use that for another project anyway. But in this quilt here, I'm using all that extra fabric for the center squares on the quilt. So there is no wasted fabric. It's just pre-planning your borders so you can cut them the long way on the fabric and have just the right amount of fabric left over to make the center of that quilt. Now on this quilt, there's not 4 borders, there are 8 borders because you have the applique border, you've got the clamshell border, which is also applique, and then you've got the center portion of the quilt. So how are we going to figure out how much yardage we need? Well, for that, I need to draw a layout diagram. I'm going to put similar size borders together. So I have my shorter borders over here, and I'm going to change those. So I need those 7 inches. I need these to be 8 inches, and I need these to be 9. All of these are going to be 9. Okay. So I have 4 borders that are 9 by either 68 length or 73 length. Okay, so those are my outside borders. And then for my inside borders, I have 7 by 51 and 8 by 43. So in both of those cases, when I add up all 4 borders, it's less than the 40 inches. So I can cut that border right along the selvage edge to get the flattest borders possible. So first of all, we need to talk about the anatomy of our fabric, right? What is that selvage edge? Well, many of you know the answer to that already, but I want to show you. The selvage edge goes along the full length of the fabric, and then you cut your fabric into yard pieces or yard and a half, whatever that is, along that selvage edge. So when it's on the bolt, the length on the bolt has 2 selvage edges. Now sometimes those selvages are really tight, and sometimes they have a little fuzz along the edges. It doesn't really matter if they're fuzzy or if they're that tightly woven band along the edge. You can tell the selvage edge because it's not going to fray. Any of your cut edges, you're going to be able to pull strings along your cut edges. So when you're cutting across your fabric, you have this raw edge where you can pull out threads. On this long edge, that selvage edge is tightly woven. It's made to pull your fabric through all of the machines that it has to go through processing. So it has to be really strong. And it's made when they weave the fabric, when they're weaving back and forth, this creates the selvage edge over here. Okay, so we've determined what the selvage edge is. It's the long length. Now, I bought this fabric at a discount store. It is narrow. They must have used it for some kits, and they must have cut some long borders for a kit. So I bought this fabric, and it's narrower than your full 40-inch width. Well, that's okay for the quilt that I'm going to make. But because I don't have that 40-inch width, I'm going to have to cut borders, border after border after border along this length. But I want to show you how to make sure that those are absolutely straight. So when we have our selvage edge, we are going to measure for our borders. So on one of mine, the maximum length is 51. Okay, but I have already washed and pressed my fabric. So if I were purchasing fabric for this quilt, I would add up the longest border here, 78. I would add the longest border here, 51. So 78 plus 51. And then I'm going to multiply that by my shrinkage amount, 5%. So I multiply those numbers added together by 1.05. That's going to add on 5%, so you know how much fabric to purchase. So in this case, even though I need 73 inches for the border, I'm going to wash 77 inches. For this border that ends up 51 max, I'm going to wash 54 inches because that allows for that 5% shrinkage. Okay? So total, I'm going to add up the 77 and the 54, and that's how much fabric I need to purchase. Then you're going to put this in the wash. So you might want to break it down into smaller pieces so that washing it and ironing it is a little bit easier. So go ahead and break it down 77 inches before washing. That's going to give us at least 73 after washing. Same thing over here, 54 before washing. That's going to give us at least 51 after washing. So I've already washed and pressed this fabric. Now I need to cut it to that 51 inches. So I go to my ruler that's on my cutting mat, and if I do 51 inches, that's 25 and 26. Now the ruler is not big enough to do the 51. So I'm going to do 25 and 26. Now, I'm going to cut it just a hair longer, maybe an inch longer, because I'm going to do it 2 inches longer, because I'm going to tear that fabric. Now, you don't have to tear your fabric. I just want to do this quickly for you so that you can see me move on with this process. Okay, so now I have my 51-inch piece of fabric, and it has 2 selvage edges. Yours will have 2 selvage edges. Mine only has 1. I'm going to move behind the table now so that you can see what I'm going to do next to cut my long borders. All right, so to cut my long borders, I'm going to take that length of fabric. I'm doing this a little bit smaller than you need to do for this quilt. It's about half the size, just so that I can more easily demonstrate this process and you can see the whole selvage edge. Now, I do want to remove that selvage edge. So I'm going to put the selvages together very carefully so that they're nice and straight. And I'm going to fold it twice. Now, even 110-inch long border, which I think is the longest that I have for this project, but even that super long border, when I fold it twice, it still fits on my board. So you're going to take the measurement of your longest border and make sure you have a board that's big enough to cut right across that fabric that's folded twice. So when I fold my fabric, I want to do this again. I'm going to be lining up those selvages. You could absolutely pin them together if you have a really long piece. My piece isn't very long, so I'm just going to hold it nice and tight. If I divide it exactly in half, so I'm putting my finger in there and I'm stretching it, so I'm laying these flat, one next to the other. Then I'm going to go the other way, and I'm going to put my finger in there and I'm going to stretch so that these selvages are perfectly lined up on the edge. Then I'm going to lay it down on my board and I'm going to smooth it and make sure that those folds are nice and smooth. So the fold over here and the fold over here are nice and smooth. Now what happens if you go to line up your selvages and the edge of your fabric here where the two overlap, what if they're really, really crooked? Mine are really straight. I'm very happy with this fabric. It's nice and straight. Sometimes when your fabric is going through the machines, it has clips along the edge of those machines that bring the fabric through the textile machines. If that fabric is at all skewed, it's going to remain that way through the whole process. that's going to create kind of a diagonal line here at the end of your fabric. If your fabric doesn't go flat and straight across like that, if it goes kind of at an angle, it's okay. That can happen. You're still going to match up those selvage edges, but we have to pay attention. These selvage edges, you can slide by each other. You can move them back and forth until you get that fabric to lie perfectly straight. If those edges are not perfect, if the cut edge here is not perfectly straight, I'm not going to worry about that. I need to make sure my selvage edges are perfectly straight, so I'm going to slide them back and forth until this fold can lay straight on your table. Now, if you run your hand like this and it ripples, 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 and it will never lay straight, that's when you need to slide those selvage edges back and forth over each other. So if I do that on this one, that's where I'm getting that puckering. See that? Because it's not lined up. If the edges are skewed, you'll have to move this selvage one over the other until you get this edge to lie straight. So let's keep going. Mine is even, so I can put my two ends together. I really need to hang it right up and down and just let it fall. Let it fall. Just kind of move it around until it falls. Hold this edge out tight. So those selvage edges are one on top of the other. And now you can see I've got this beautiful fold. It folds perfectly all the way down. If you're not getting a nice fold like that, you're going to have to adjust your selvage edges this way until you get it to lay flat. I know that I'm getting in great detail here because you have probably run into fabric that's not cut straight, or it's not processed straight. And what do when you have that problem? Well, you need to know how to handle it. So I'm going to teach you how to handle even those unforeseen problems. Okay, so now these two edges, because I folded it twice, I've got a single fold here. I've got my cut edges over here on top of that fold, and now I've got a double fold here. I want to feel that double fold. Is there any gap between the fabrics? No. Those folds are one on top of the other. So there's no bunching, there's no puckering, there's no gap. These folds are nice and tight together. And I made them nice and tight together by holding it up, shaking it out, and making sure that everything was exactly even. Okay, now that I have that nice, tight double fold, I'm going to use my largest square ruler, and I'm going to put it right up against that edge. So my longest square ruler, so I have a line that goes all the way across that fold. And look, it's nice and straight on the selvage edge as well. So I'm going to take off enough of that edge to get rid of that tightly woven selvage. And what do we do with those tightly woven selvages? Just about anything. I tied up my clipboard so I could hang it on the wall with a piece of selvage. It acts like a ribbon, doesn't it? And my friend Bee, she said she ties up her tomato plants with selvage. It's really strong, it's really soft, and it works for so many things. So don't throw those selvages away. I keep a little basket right there, and I just throw them in my basket. Okay, this is where you might want a table where you can work from both sides. Because I can work from both sides of this table, I could come over here now and I can cut the size of the pieces I need to cut. So for this quilt, I need to cut, let me double check my measurements. Let's see. I need to cut 7 inches by 51. I need to cut 8 inches by 43. So the first 2 borders that I cut, I'm going to do the longest ones first. Then I'm going to cut those 8-inch borders. So 2 at 7 by 51, 2 at 8 by 43. Okay, so I would come on this side of the table, but that's not going to be very good for you, is it? But we're going to try it anyway, because it's just the easiest way to cut without having to move this fabric around once you make the initial cut. If you need to move the fabric around, you might get it a little bit out of whack, right? Those edges might not line up perfectly. I like to leave it right in place and just walk around the table to make my next cut. So I'm going to do 7 inches by 51. Let's see if I can do that. Let's just move that over. We're going to do 7 inches. Okay, so I'm going to cut 1 at 7. Now, why am I using this great big ruler? Because I'm keeping this straight edge, a line on my ruler, right along that fold. Let's put that one aside, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut a second one. 7 inches, straight edge right here on that fold, making sure that we're still straight up, top, and bottom. If we're not straight top and bottom here and here, it's much more important that this straight edge right here is accurate. So I can overcut a little bit. I think I slipped the first time I was cutting because I was trying to stay out of the camera, and I didn't have the ruler secured the way that I needed to. So I'm going to come back over here, and now I'm going to double check the size of that border. So I need 7 inches. 7 inches, make sure my lines go straight along each fold, and I'm just going to trim that one down a little bit. Yeah, I slipped on my first cut, so I just had this little sliver that was just a tiny bit too big. Now, when you unfold those borders, look how straight they are. I'm going to unfold it one more time, and you can see that I have a perfectly straight border. It goes straight all the way across. Now, I failed to tell you why I cut along the selvage edge, and I'm going to show you. I'll show you why, but I also want to keep going with this cut so I can show you what comes next. If you stretch the width of the fabric, that's across the fabric, that 40-inch wide across. If I cut across that fabric is going to have some stretch to it. If I stretch across the selvage edge, let's do that. Look at that. No stretch at all. So these borders across the length, because I cut them along the selvage, no stretch at all. What if I cut my borders across the width to save fabric? So I would have, say, an 8-inch by 40, another 8-inch by 40. I'd have to put the two of those together, and then I'd have to cut that down to 51 inches. Or say I need 110 inches for this size quilt. I'm going to have to cut 3 pieces, sew those together with 2 seams, and then I can get my 110 length. That's the way most teachers are teaching these days, or some teachers, I shouldn't say most. That's the way some teachers are teaching these days, and I don't agree with it. If you are cutting across your width, you're going to have all that stretch when you put your borders on the quilt. Not only that, but you're going to have at least 1 seam, if not 2 seams across that border. Well, I'm doing an applique border, and if I have a seam here and here, you're going to see that. If I'm using just the width of the fabric, that 40 inches, you're going to see multiple seams in my borders. I don't like that. I don't like to see any seams in my borders, and I certainly don't want my borders to stretch. Okay, so we've got 2 of those borders cut. After making 2 cuts, I'm going to start again. Why? Because as I was handling this fabric, it might have gotten a little bit out of alignment. As I was cutting, it could have gotten a little bit out of alignment. And if you have the whole 40-inch width, the part that you're holding in your hands is going to be folded perfectly. But the part that's down low, that you're just hanging and fluffing like this, it may not be perfectly folded. So after cutting twice, I'm going to fold again. So I'm going to fold twice on that selvage edge. Now it's not a selvage anymore. I took the selvage off. So how do I know that's the selvage edge? Well, first of all, it's the longest piece. But secondly, stretch it. There's no stretch. So I know that's the selvage edge, even if I have removed that selvage. So here we go. We're a little bit off. We want to make sure that our folds are all lined up with the edges of our quilt. So I'm gonna pull it nice and tight this way. Then I'm gonna fold it again, pull it nice and tight. Make sure that it's laying nice and flat. Check those folds, make sure they're not lumpy. Those folds are both good, and this one is a double fold and it's straight all the way along. So let's do this again. This time, I tell you what, this time I'm going to do my first cut here. That way I can do my subsequent cuts on the other side of the table. Okay, so I'm going to line up this edge with the straight edge on the ruler and give that a cut. Okay, now I can measure over on this side of the table from this edge. I left my instructions up here, so let's see what size I need to make now. So I did my two borders that were 8 by 42. Now I need to do the 6.5 by 50. 6.5 is the finished size, so they need to be cut at 7. And let's see, did I cut these at 7 or 8? I cut these at 7. So now I need to do the 8-inch borders. Okay, the 8-inch border, straight along this edge, straight here up and down. Make sure it's straight in both directions before you cut. And now I'm going to make my first cut. I need some Grace True Grips on the back of this ruler. I don't have Grace True Grips on the ruler and it's slipping on me. So let's go ahead and make our next cut. 8 inches here, straight across the edge here. Now I'm going to lay my whole arm down on here. I've got one Grace True Grip, but only in the corner. So I want to make sure I'm putting pressure on my ruler and pressure on my blade to get a beautifully cut border. Okay, so these are cut well and they are nice and straight. What do I mean by nice and straight? If you were not measuring with this line on your ruler and this line on your ruler, say you're using a narrow ruler and you're trying to make a 2-inch border, well, there's not a whole lot of this line to put along the fold. So you can easily put this line on this edge, but say this was tilted just a little bit. If you make this cut and you're not square here and here, you're going to get a V-shaped border. It's going to have a little jog in it like a V. So what I like to do, even if I'm using a long ruler, I put a second ruler next to it. That way I make sure I can measure across the entire bottom there before I make my cuts. That's going to give me a much straighter cut when I have more of a line to line up on that bottom fold. So when you only are cutting thin strips, use the second ruler and make sure that those thin strips, maybe you're going to cut 1 inch wide, there's only 1 inch here to put on that bottom fold. It's really hard to judge whether or not that's straight. So by putting another ruler up against it, make sure you're on that bottom fold, and we need to adjust it a little bit. That's what's going to give you really straight cuts. So I don't recommend using a long ruler. I'd rather fold twice, as long as they're folded nice and tight. Then I'm going to use a big old square ruler. That's going to give me more accurate cuts. Okay, so I think I've covered everything on making those borders nice and straight. Now, when you are calculating how much yardage you need, if you have borders that are bigger than 10 inches wide, and you can fit 4 10-inch wide borders across your width, you're going to need to buy the length of those borders twice. If, say, you have a 13-inch border, you're going to need to cut the length twice in order to make 4 borders. So you have 13 and 13, that's 26 inches. You can't fit 2 more 13-inch borders on that fabric. Now, if you're doing long horizontals, you're going to cut your 2 long ones on one piece and your 2 shorter ones on the second piece. So it's not quite twice as much fabric. You've got your long measurement and your short measurement. Now, don't forget to multiply that measurement by 1.05 to get the amount of fabric you need that will include the shrinkage. So, you're probably wondering why I wash my fabric before I make my quilts. Well, one of the reasons why I wash my fabric is because I'm doing applique quilts, and I want all the chemicals off the surface of that fabric so that my fusible will adhere better. I'm doing fusible applique quilts, and I want my fusible to stick. So let's get rid of all of those finishes. The second reason why you want to wash your fabric is to get rid of that shrinkage. You don't want to put your borders on the quilt and then have everything shrink differently in that quilt. One fabric might shrink 5%, one fabric might not shrink at all. Depending on the weave of the fabric, you can even have some fabrics that will get a little bit bigger if it's a really loosely woven fabric. So when you're ironing it, it might stretch. So you certainly want to get rid of the shrinkage. So you're starting off right off the bat with an even slate. Nothing's going to shrink, so you're not going to get ripply seams when you're sewing your quilt together. I love to make beautiful quality quilts, and it's all these little tiny details that add up one on top of the other to give you a beautiful finish to your quilt. Yes, there are lots of details, and it's good to know the quilting rules so that we can break them. What if you don't want to spend extra money on that fabric and you want to cut your borders across the width of fabric and you don't mind the seams? Well, you can absolutely do that. But you need to know what you're up against, right? So you're going to have a little bit more stretch when you cut your borders across the width of the fabric. So if you know that, you're going to be extra careful when you put those borders on to make sure that they don't stretch. Now, of course, stretching can happen during quilting. It can happen during piecing. So I can't say always, but that's an absolute, and I hate to use absolutes, but 99% of the time, I'm going to cut my borders on the length of that fabric along the selvage edges, so I don't have to be careful. I'm starting off with the best quality border I can with no seams. Seams enter. When you add seams, there's another room for error, right? If your seams aren't exactly 1/4 of an inch, there you go. Your borders might not be exactly the right size. So all of those factors, as long as you know what can go wrong, you can prevent that from going wrong. So I like to give you all of the details so that you can make the best quality quilts possible. Now we have some more time. So now that we are done with cutting our borders, I want to talk about those clamshells. Now I do need to cut my clamshell borders. The borders that I cut were the inside borders. So let's talk about those outside borders. The outside borders are 72, my longest one, and 67 for my longest one, the mitered border. Now that's the outside measurement, the widest part of that border, not this inside measurement right here. Again, the outside measurement here, not this inside measurement. So I need to cut my borders 72 inches long and 67 inches long. I always add an inch. That way, when I'm pinning my borders to the quilt, I measure that 67 inches. It's going to give me a ½ inch on either end. I measure and I put a mark 67 inches apart. I center that. So I've got a ½ inch, then a mark. Then I've got my 67 inches. I've got another mark, and then I've got another ½ inch. So when I'm putting my borders on the quilt has to fit between the two marks. Why do I do that? Why do I add that extra ½ inch instead of them just being blunt across the end? Well, if your piecing isn't perfect, if there's any variation in the inside of your quilt, if there's any variation at all, and you put your borders on and they don't quite make it till the end, you want to know that, right? You want to square up each section of your quilt. So when I add my first two borders onto that center section, I'm going to square up the ends. If they're ever so slightly off, even 1/8 of an inch, they're going to angle down a little bit from that center section. I want them to be perfectly square and straight across. So I make sure that I have that little bit extra so I can square them up perfectly. When you're sewing one to the other, it's hard to get that big old border to match perfectly at the end when you start sewing and when you end your sewing. So I give myself just a little bit of leeway. I do put the quilt between the two measurements. So I know that quilt fits the final size of the border perfectly. But when I square it up, I want a few threads for wiggle room. So I don't have a border that angles down slightly away from that seam. Okay, so I've given you a whole bunch of tips on cutting those straight borders, then adding those straight borders to your quilt. When we do the Kaffe Clamshell Quilt Along, which is starting tonight, we are going to be also talking about mitered borders. So if that's something that you want to work on, this would be a great project for you. Now I'm getting ready for that project, and I've cut all of my 5-inch squares for that outer clamshell border. So I'm using a different collection of fabrics. They are the Kaffe pastel fabrics, and I think this is going to be just gorgeous. So if you want to quilt along with me and make this beautiful quilt, we are starting tonight, but you've got an entire month to make your session 1, to do your session 1 instructions. And session 1 is making the 4 clamshell borders. So join in. I would love for you to quilt along with me. If you're watching this video and it's not June 2023, because this video is going to be on YouTube, it's also going to be in my membership, and you'll also find it on my Rotary Cut Applique Facebook page. So if you're watching the video and it's not June 2023, you can still make this quilt. This course will live forever on my website. And once you purchase the course, you have it for good. So you can start this quilt at any time, even if you're not quilting along with me. So come and join me at SuePellinDesigns.com. Look for the Kaffe Clamshell course. You can search that right on the website, and you'll be able to join in the fun. Now, if you're going to join me tonight, I can't wait to get ready. Now, it's not tonight. It's this afternoon at 4 o'clock. We're going to be starting our Kaffe Clamshell Quilt Along. I'm so excited to get started. I can't wait to do that. So I'm going to sign off. I'm going to iron the rest of my border fabric. I didn't get it all ironed yet, and I've got yards and yards of this border fabric. This fabric is going to be used, I'm using this peachy color for the entire background of that quilt. Now, if you missed the session where I chose the fabric for this background, we auditioned a couple of different fabrics against those cave pastels. If you missed that session, that was last week on Sewing in Slippers with Sue. Now, if you want to follow along, you can always join my newsletter list. If you join the newsletter, you're going to get a free pattern for a mini quilt, which can be a mug rug, it can be a pin quilt. You can even make a set of coasters using that pattern. And we do have a free video on how to use your Leaves Galore tools to make a orange peel pin quilt or mug rug or a set of coasters. So it's a great way to get started with applique with me. And if you'd like to learn to applique, I'm Sue Pelland from Sue Pelland Designs, and I would love to be your applique mentor and your applique teacher. So come along and join us, and we will get you started. Now, I'm going to go ahead and look at the comments and just make sure that we're all good. Yes, I don't see any questions in the comments. So thank you so much for joining me for Sewing in Slippers with Sue. I hope you've enjoyed learning all about making quality borders on your quilts, and I will see you again next time. Thank you all.